Hours after a ceasefire was announced between Russia and Ukraine over strikes in the Black Sea, Moscow said it wants Western economic sanctions lifted before agreeing to this deal. Hello, I'm Mike Walter, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. After days of U.S.-led negotiations in Saudi Arabia, Ukraine and Russia agreed to halt military strikes in the Black Sea and to refrain from attacking critical energy infrastructure. William Denslow reports from Kyiv.
Tuesday, the Ukrainian leader cautiously welcomed the deal.
It doesn't say in the statement what happens if someone violates the agreements. I understand why, because the American side really wanted all this not to fall apart. And still, we will have to understand the answers to each of the details with you.
But this partial ceasefire agreement is already on shaky ground. According to Ukrainian officials, Russia attacked the country on Tuesday night with 117 strike drones. President Volodymyr Zelensky says this is a clear signal that Moscow isn't going to pursue real peace. Meanwhile, Russia says it shot down 2 Ukrainian drones over the Black Sea, amid claims other areas were also attacked. Ahead of overnight military action, Moscow had clarified that it saw sanctions relief is a prerequisite for the ceasefire to come into effect. On the streets of Kyiv, residents were unimpressed with the US brokered deal.
I think they're just trying to win more time, and they understand that they need to talk about something and have those negotiations.
The US says it's reviewing the conditions laid out by Moscow.
We are very cautious about lifting any Russian sanctions, and we want to know what it's, and we want to know that it's done for exchange of something tangible.
The Kremlin insisted Wednesday that President Putin's order for a moratorium on attacking energy infrastructure remain in place. However, Ukrainian officials insist Russia is already manipulating the agreement reached in the Saudi capital. Ukraine's foreign minister saying that pressure is the only cure for Russian lies. William Denslow, CGTN, Kyiv.
We've got a lot to discuss, so let's bring in our guest from London. Marcus Papadopoulos is a historian, analyst, and author specializing in Russia. From Dallas, Sergiy Kudelia is an associate professor of political science at Baylor University. Here in Washington, D.C., Eugene Chausovsky is a geopolitical analyst. And in our studio, Anton Fedyashin is a professor of history at American University. I want to welcome all of you to the show. Marcus, why don't I begin with you? There was this announcement of a maritime ceasefire. Came on the heels of 3 days of peace talks in Saudi Arabia, but as you saw in that report from Will Denslow, there's really not even an agreement about what the agreement is. Russia sees it one way, Ukraine sees it another. What do we make of this?
Well, as is the case in any war, there are claims and counterclaims. I am in no position whatsoever, as indeed the rest of the panel are in no position whatsoever, to say with any certainty if Russia violated the agreement or if Ukraine violated the agreement. That said, the most important thing is that America and Russia are talking to each other. Let us not forget that for a number of years, there was almost no contact between the White House and the Kremlin. That was an exceedingly dangerous situation for world peace and world stability. After all, America and Russia are the 2 nuclear superpowers. They possess between themselves something like 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. So again, the most important thing is that Trump and Putin are speaking. Now, can this be resolved? Well, if the war in Ukraine was a direct war between Ukraine and Russia, then there would have been a strong possibility that the war could have been brought to an end by peaceful means. The problem facing Trump is that it is not simply a war between Ukraine and Russia. It is a proxy war between NATO and Ukraine and Russia on the other side. NATO has saturated Ukraine with military hardware. Thus, this is going to be an extremely difficult war to bring to an end by peaceful means. I sincerely hope that Trump and Putin can bring the war to an end peacefully, but there is another problem facing Trump, namely, he is not fully in control of America. The American deep state or the American establishment remains entrenched in power in America. Thus, the deep state controls the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, the State Department, the military, and so on and so on. So whilst Trump and Putin are talking to each other, at the same time, the American deep state and, of course, the British deep state are working behind the scenes to try and scuttle Trump's efforts to end the war in Ukraine.
Okay, let me move to Sergey. As I mentioned, Ukraine kind of was under the impression that the ceasefire would go into effect once the announcement was made. Of course, Russia's saying no, the economic sanctions have to be lifted first. We did have these strikes in port cities in Ukraine. Zelensky saying this is a clear sign that Russia does not want peace. What would you say the sentiment is in Ukraine right now?
So the sentiment with regard to these negotiations, the latest round of negotiations, is very pessimistic, because the very modality, the so-called shuttle diplomacy, where Americans and Ukrainians are talking separately from Russians and Americans, where Ukrainians basically have no idea what Russians are demanding of Americans, what kind of promises Americans are giving to the Russians. This whole argument about sanctions lifted as the preliminary step to ceasefire was a complete surprise to the Ukrainian side. So this shuttle diplomacy modality is highly flawed. And Ukraine, unfortunately, because of that, does not have a very good sense of what the agreement is, what the agreement entails, how can it be monitored, how can this agreement be enforced. As a result, it feels like we have a perception, suspicion, many people in Ukraine have a suspicion that this whole negotiation argument is a cover-up for collusion between the United States, the Trump administration, and the Putin government, and an attempt to basically lift sanctions, start lifting sanctions, and maybe dismantle the whole sanctions regime against Russia, arguing that it's basically either is a concession to Russians or something that the Americans have to do because the Ukrainians are not cooperating on the ceasefire. And one more thing I want to add on to what just the previous speaker said. The real threat to international order and stability is not in the fact that Americans and Russians have not been speaking for a while, but in the fact that Russians and Ukrainians are at war, that the Russians are attacking and trying to capture parts of Ukraine still. This is the real threat. And hence the focus should be on trying to bring Russians and Ukrainians to the negotiation table and trying to mediate between them in a neutral and impartial manner.
Eugene, there was an article on the BBC website that says the Black Sea has really not been a central focus in the fighting. The fighting, of course, taking place on the ground. They're saying the real winner in this deal is Russia, which has struggled to export some of its agricultural products. Is that how you see it? And what do we make of this early agreement and kind of the difficulty in one side sees it one way, the other sees it another way?
Right. Well, the Black Sea, was previously a central focal point. It's actually the one significant agreement that's been happening since the full-scale invasion happened, and this was brokered by Turkey in terms of the Black Sea grain deal. That did eventually collapse after about a year or so. So there's been a lot less activity happening, and the supply chain routes have shifted since then. So this has not been a central focal point, though there is maritime activity happening in the Black Sea. Most of the attacks, of course, happening on the front lines, as well as the kind of the hybrid attacks that we're seeing, drones against energy infrastructure and so on. I think that the main issue here right now is one of sequencing. So obviously, despite this agreement, we still see continued attacks happening. Russia saying that the sanctions need to be lifted in order for the ceasefire to be implemented, whereas, of course, Ukraine and some of its European backers are looking for the ceasefire first to happen and then those kinds of easing of restrictions against Russia can be discussed. The key difference here, I think, is the position of the U.S. We saw the same issue kind of raise up even 10 years ago in terms of Minsk I and Minsk II, but here we have the U.S. playing a different role. I think it's going to be applying pressure against both Ukraine and, if necessary, against Russia in order to get that agreement, moving forward. But clearly, we're seeing the sticking points really making themselves felt at this point.
Anton, on this issue of applying pressure, the Trump administration obviously wants a breakthrough here. Trump on the campaign trail said he could bring an end to this war rather quickly. In an interview with Newsmax, he suggested Russia could be dragging his feet and attempting to delay an end to the war. What do you read into his comments about that, and where do you see things going?
Well, I don't know about Russia delaying an end to the war, but the Russians are certainly resisting an all-out ceasefire, and they were absolutely clear about not agreeing to an all-out ceasefire while their army is slowly moving forward and defeating the Ukrainian army in the field. So that they took off the table. I agree with Sergiy when he said that ultimately it would be most helpful if the Ukrainians and the Russians spoke directly with each other, even with the Americans as mediators, but not through shuttle diplomacy going back and forth. But part of the problem for why that hasn't happened is that that's been tried twice. It was done with the Minsk agreements. And then we found out from the Ukrainian president and then Angela Merkel of Germany and Francois Hollande of France that neither the Ukrainians nor their European guarantors actually intended to implement it. And then it happened again at Istanbul, right after the special military operation was launched by the Russians, and the Ukrainians walked away from that. And currently, there is an executive order by President Zelensky that forbids him or any other Ukrainian official from actually engaging in direct negotiations with the Russians. So it's not because the Russians and the Americans want to keep the Ukrainians out, it's that there's a law that forbids them to communicate directly. Once Zelensky rescinds that law, maybe then the next steps will be taken. That remains to be seen. But the bigger picture here, I think, is the following. The Trump administration has decided that it wants to extricate itself from the Ukraine debacle. And listening to Witkoff's interview with Tucker Carlson, what struck me was the very business-like transactional attitude that the administration is taking to this whole conflict. He spoke in terms of business plans and benefits and losses. The Americans want out, and that explains this rush and this sort of stumbling over very important components of any ceasefire, because the Trump administration just wants to get out as soon as possible. And if the Europeans want to continue with funding the war, then the administration here in D.C. is just going to let them do it. So I think that's where the misunderstandings lie. So it's in everyone's interest to come to the negotiating table as soon as possible and put an end to this.
But you and I had a chance to chat before we went on the air, and I mentioned I just talked to top lieutenants with Henry Kissinger talking about the talks with Hanoi and how long that took. Getting a quick resolution to this, that seems almost impossible, doesn't it?
It doesn't see. History proves that it's impossible, and we've got centuries of memoirs and examples of negotiations that drag out forever. We don't have to go back far into history. Look at how long it took the Israelis and Hamas to hammer out, by the way, through mediators also, to hammer out a ceasefire that has now broken down. Again, you go back to the Vietnam era, there was almost a decade's worth of negotiations before the United States pulled out, and then the war flared up again and ended up with a northern Vietnamese victory. So there are many precedents. The question is, A, taking the first step, which Trump administration has done, but two, is now being patient about pursuing diplomacy. It's going to be a long drive.
Yeah, Sergiy, there are concerns being raised about the negotiations following this trip by the envoy to Russia, which Anton just alluded to. The Kyiv Independent, a Ukrainian online newspaper, published a blistering editorial just a couple of days ago. It wrote, in any negotiations, one of the most powerful weapons is knowledge. In that regard, the U.S. envoy, Steve Witkoff, is willfully disarmed. It goes on to say that in the negotiation where everything is at stake, Ukraine's most powerful ally is represented by a man who either knows next to nothing about Ukraine or woefully misunderstands it. Is that kind of the sentiment you're getting from the folks in Ukraine? Are they concerned about, his method? As Anton said, it's kind of business-like. He's a real estate guy who was a real estate lawyer and then a developer, and kind of looking at this as rather transactional.
Yeah, so Ukrainians have been shocked many times since Trump administration came to power, but it seems like there is no end to these types of shocks. And the Witkoff's interview with Tucker Carlson was another huge unpleasant surprise for many Ukrainians. And the reasons for it are several. So first, of course, is the fact that he was talking about certain elements of the war in ways that reminded many Ukrainians of the arguments that they heard from Putin, like justifying the territorial conquest of the 4 regions by the fact that the Russian speakers there, and they supposedly participated in the referendum, which, as we know, did not take place, and it was basically a big show. And another argument that we heard from him is this historical justification of the takeover of Crimea, saying that it was basically given to the Ukrainians by the Russians, and hence it sort of deserves to go back. There are many other elements to his interview that were really surprising. But it's also important to note that many believe that there is something about the relationship that Witkoff has with, or established with, Putin, something about his potential business interest in Russia that may raise the issues about the conflict of interest. Because apart from just being a mediator, a negotiator, his real job for many decades was being a real estate developer, was a lawyer before. So he has huge business interests, and his company has a significant business interests and assets abroad. And so many are suspicious about the ties that he is expecting to build, political ties in Russia that will help him to advance these businesses. So a variety of different factors raise questions about whether Witkoff is the right guy to participate in these election negotiations and present himself as a neutral mediator between Russia and Ukraine.
Eugene, of course, European leaders are talking about next steps with regard to Ukraine. France working with Britain on some options there. They're talking about this coalition of the willing. What do you see emerging from talks there?
Right. So I think the Europeans, in some ways, like Ukraine, feel a little bit left out of these talks that are happening directly between the U.S. and Russia, but are trying to, serve as a backstop, if you will. I know that the European leaders are going to be meeting in France tomorrow, I believe. Zelensky, I think, arrived there today. So in the event that we do have a ceasefire that's able to actually be implemented, I think the Europeans will be playing an important role, whether that's from a peacekeeping force or some kind of security, and certainly from a reconstruction perspective, I think the Europeans will be quite involved. But right now, the main kind of thrust of the negotiations are happening essentially between the U.S. and Russia. I agree, that the Trump administration is taking more of a transactional stance on these negotiations. But I think that will actually apply not only to Ukraine, but also to Russia as well. So if we see that, for example, if Russia stalls out on the negotiations or the implementation, we could see, rather than easing of sanctions, an intensification. But that same thing can happen, as we've seen, of course, against Ukraine as well.
Marcus, he mentioned peacekeeping forces, and I know that you have strong feelings on this. You posted on X that peacekeeping troops in Ukraine could make matters worse. We'll put up your comments on the screen, and I want you to kind of amplify on that. You even suggested it could ultimately lead to a nuclear war and wholesale destruction. Give us your thoughts.
Well, please allow me to say, first of all, that the term coalition of the willing is typical language of British officialdom, namely grand sounding with no practical meaning. Furthermore, who exactly is willing? I can assure you from now that the British people, along with the German people, the French people, the Italian people, and so on, are not willing to go to war with Russia. They are not willing to risk nuclear Armageddon. Thus, the question again is, who exactly is willing? Well, I will tell you who is willing, according to British officialdom. The British ruling elite is willing, and the European ruling elites are willing. But these people will not send their sons and daughters to Ukraine. No, they will send other people's sons and daughters to Ukraine to die and to possibly risk a nuclear war. That all said, Coalition of the Willing is an attempt by the British establishment to derail the Trump administration's efforts to bring the war in Ukraine to a peaceful end. It is also another way of attempting to distract British public opinion away from the catastrophic problems which are destroying the United Kingdom. The British state has gone to war with its own people, a cultural war in which the national identity of the British people has been systematically destroyed. So again, the British people do not support Ukraine. They do not support Russia. They want to see Britain put first. They don't want any more British taxpayers' money leaving the country. They want the British people and the British economy to benefit from British taxpayers' money. No European troops will be deployed to Ukraine. It is as simple as that. America has an almighty political, economic, and military hold over Britain and continental Europe. So the puppet Starmer can come out with whatever language he wants. He knows that the coalition of the willing amounts to nothing in practice. Indeed, recently we learned that the British military chiefs have told the puppet Starmer that the coalition of the willing is nothing but, quote, political theatre. There will not be a World War III because America and Russia will simply not allow it.
Political theater, that's not what Witkoff says, but he is indicating it's posturing. But this is going to be a sticking point, isn't it? I mean, somebody's got to be there on the ground, and I don't think that it's really a non-starter with Russia to have European troops there, right? I mean, what does that look like?
Well, first, we need to get to a ceasefire on the ground, and we're nowhere close. That's number one. If we do come to that point, the Russians are going to block the Europeans from setting foot there. And I have to agree with Mark, because more and more articles are appearing in the British press, including papers that have been very pro-Ukrainian. And these articles are arguing that this whole plan is absolutely bonkers, that Great Britain has neither the money nor the actual men and material, the resources to field an expeditionary force, let alone nor do the rest of the European countries. The Russians will block that anyway. That's understandable because the Ukrainians wouldn't allow the Belarusians, for example, to be a peacekeeping or observing force. But look, history is full of examples, Mike, where outside forces were brought in. And there's a whole global south, as we call it, or the global majority of countries, including African, Asian states, who could bring in troops, or even UN troops who could be brought in. And all of that will be negotiated. It's going to be a painstaking process. But I don't think we're anywhere close to seeing any European peacekeepers on the ground. And in that sense, I think this is all really is political theater and grandstanding.
And Sergey, there was a piece in Politico, an opinion piece from the daughter of Putin critic Boris Nemtsov, who was killed in 2015. She says that Putin basically wants a ceasefire just to give him time to rearm and enlist more soldiers, bolster the ranks, if you will, and then resume the attacks. I want to get your thoughts on that, and is that a concern?
Well, it's a very serious concern, and this is one of the key obstacles, I think, to any type of ceasefire agreement, because Putin's condition, as we heard he said several times, is during the ceasefire period, Ukraine should not receive any heavy equipment, military equipment from the West. So in a way, because there is obviously a very developed military industry in Russia, Russia can build up its military capacity and compensate for the losses over several years, while Ukraine would basically remain in a very difficult and weaker position militarily. And so the asymmetry of power between the two sides will grow. And if we did not address the key fundamental issues, in other words, if the ceasefire is just end fighting, but there is no broader, fundamental, comprehensive peace agreement, then Russia will have an incentive to restart its military offensive if it still feels that these issues that are of concern to it are important. So I think in this way, and other topics associated with the presence of peacekeepers to ensure monitoring of the ceasefire agreement, that is obviously a very important sticking point that is very hard to resolve at this point.
Eugene, there's been a recent poll that shows about 76% of Russians would support Putin signing a peace agreement with Ukraine. This gets back to sort of the fatigue factor, which has kind of resonated in this conversation. The U.S. fatigued by this. Clearly, Ukraine and Russia, they'd like to see an end to this, but on their own terms. And as we pointed out, some European countries also want this to come to a conclusion. Can you talk a little bit more about the fatigue factor?
Right. I mean, this war has been going on, I mean, not just for the last 3 years, obviously it's been more intense, but going back to 2014. So we're more than a decade into this conflict. It's taken its toll, I mean, first and foremost on the human front, of course, but also economically, politically. You know, Russia has been able to withstand, you know, some of that pressure from the West by diversifying its relationships, looking to countries like China and countries in the global south, but its economy certainly has been weakened, and it's not able to kind of conduct these types of military operations indefinitely. So I think that is one of the forces, you know, allowing Russia or you know, influencing Russia to come to the negotiating table, and of course similarly for the Ukrainian side. So I think we're broadly speaking moving towards this diplomatic de-escalation, but I think as most of the panelists have mentioned, there's a lot of sticking points. You know, Russia has its own objectives and demands, the US, Europeans, Ukraine as well. So I think it's going to be a very up and down process, but the fact that the war has gone on for this long certainly is one of the factors bringing us to where we are now. Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank our guests here in the studio and our guests coming to us from far and wide. That's going to do it for us. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching another edition of The Heat.